Hello, my name is Steve. This video will be part 2 of rebuilding the sailing vessel Panope. In part 1 I showed how my father built the boat originally. It was built per plans. It's a Thomas Colvin Saugeen Witch and it was rigged as a gaff schooner. I added a pilot house in the 2000s, reworked the galley, saloon, mounted a new engine in a new location, and replaced all systems, and created a new sloop rig. Brings us to last fall, 2016. I've never been happy with the leading edge of this keel, so I stacked some aluminum plate, welded the perimeters, ground it all out, and welded it on permanently. This probably isn't going to make the boat any faster, but it certainly looks a little better. Here's the original V-berth. You'll notice that the mast passes right between. It's very cramped. Here's the very cramped head, just a place for a porta potty and a sink. Again, not very useful. Notice those small access hatches in the saloon floor. And if you could get in there, you'd find jumbled masses of lead and concrete. The bilge never drained properly. It was not cleanable. And these things just weren't happy. Didn't make me happy. So with a fire burning last fall, I went to work and I removed the forward third of the interior. I took everything out. I left the foam, but every piece of wood was removed, and the pile ended up being 800 or 900 pounds of material. It was really heavily built. So here's a new anchor locker going in. That's 5/32 aluminum. It's all welded into the hull. Everything drains down into a central sump. There's both roads, both chain portions of the roads. Down at the bottom of the picture, you'll see that spigot down there. That's so I could direct chain water aft into a sump. So here I'm getting real busy. I am pounding, prying, bashing out lead pigs, and it was cast in cement. Here I am with a hammer drill, and this was really slow going. I spent weeks, and gosh, I think actually all told it was more than a month of ballast removal. Here's a special tool I made to pry with. It's all steel. It was really a big job. It was backbreaking and very tiring. I did run out of steam and did not remove all the ballast. It was my original goal to remove all 5,000 pounds of lead and cement. And I got about half the cement out and about a third of the lead. In this forward area, I did succeed in removing all the lead and cement. But aft, here in the back part of the boat, the lead was installed vertically in cement once again, which made it extremely difficult to extract. I tried everything. I used drills, saws, chisels, everything, and nothing was very effective until I went and rented a real large jackhammer type hammer, and with a chisel bit I was able to slice off 1-inch thick segments of these pigs. And this was very slow going, back-breaking work, hunched over, dusty, just a miserable job. But I did achieve my goal of removing several hundred pounds of lead from this aft area. My goal was to get lead shifted forward for trim purposes, and that was the total amount of the lead. So the plan is to reinstall this lead in a way that fits into these spaces better. So I've got a fire going in a makeshift hearth, and I'm melting lead. Now most people, when they melt lead and recast it, they melt their lead in a crucible or a pot, and then they pour this into a mold. Well, I did things a little different. I made the mold the shape that I wanted, and I simply melt the lead directly in that mold. The mold is put together with bolts and therefore adjustable. The gaps are sealed with a stove mortar, and that lasted for quite a few firings before it had to be resealed. So here I'm clearing off the impurities and dross, and a good portion of this floating material is actually cement that was left over on the pigs. I ended up making these new bricks about 100 pounds using, well, basically using two of those original pigs each time. And to speed things up, rather than just let the fire go out, I would actually just pull the wood out and leave them burning. And then with a hose here, you'll see I cool the new ingot off, and I can put the fire back in and get the whole thing restarted again. After I got good at it, I could do a whole cycle in under an hour. About 45-50 minutes I could create a new pig. So, it wasn't real fast. I spent several days doing this over the course of a couple weeks, and eventually I had all, I think it was 15 or 1600 pounds of lead remelted. So here it's all cooled off, and the other reason to make it disassemblable, at least initially, I thought I was going to have to take it apart to get the ingot out. But lo and behold, a tap and a drop, and out they'd fall. I did end up making several sizes. Again, the mold was adjustable, but I really wanted a nice tight fit in there in the keel boxes, so I manually machined, chiseled, sawed, and ground these to fit nicely, but I did not want them to be touching any part of the aluminum keel. Lead tends to gum up tools, but otherwise you can just treat it as a hardwood, and it's slow going, but it can be cut with pretty much any saw. These two pieces fit way up forward in the very forwardmost part of the keel. Here's a template of another irregularly shaped keel bay. Just making some marks and some fine tuning. For a long time, I was trying to devise a real simple, quick crane type apparatus, or some way an overhead lifting device to get all these ingots back up into the boat, and finally I just got tired of thinking about it and just carried it up by hand. That's about a 95-pound ingot. So rather than cement, I chose to reset all of this lead in epoxy. Epoxy's pretty expensive, runs about $100 a gallon if you buy the good stuff, but I was able to find tabletop epoxy. I got it from U.S. Composites, good folks to work with, and it ended up being about $30 a gallon when you buy multiple gallons at a time. Using fiberglass cloth to keep fiberglass, or keep the epoxy from cracking, but more importantly to isolate the lead from the aluminum. I ended up using quite a few gallons. It was, all told, well over 10 gallons of epoxy was placed into this keel. Maybe a little overkill, but again, I don't ever want to look in here again. This is a permanent thing. I didn't want any corrosion going on. I don't want water in there. So here's those forward keel bays. It's there's no cement anymore. It's all just lead, and it's real dense, packed in nice and low. I did end up getting the total ballast a bit lower, And after all the epoxying, I welded cover plates. This makes for a nice tidy bilge. The plates are all angled aft, so any water that does collect in there will drain aft into a good sump. Went all the way back through the saloon, all the way back to the engine with those cover plates, and cleaned up real nicely. The hull plating is original. That just got cleaned up with a wire wheel. So the redesign of the interior in the forward part of the boat needs a little wider sole, so I wanted to raise the sole up a little bit. Headroom's kind of limited. It's about 5'10" finished, and that's how tall I am. But again, I raised the sole up, I think it was 4 or 5 inches, which, as you can see from the angle of the hull sides, you get a lot wider sole. So here I'm welding this framework in. The exposed foam there is real flammable, puts off toxic fumes. I'm wearing a respirator, but the fires weren't too terrible if you get them put out right away. You let them wait and the fires get going, and you might have some problems. And here's a close-up of one of these welds. So now it's on to woodworking. You'll notice forward there I use a pattern to create all these large shapes. That's just simply door skin ripped into strips and then put together with hot glue. Here I'm working on that forward bulkhead. This bulkhead will separate the new head, which will be in the extreme forward of the boat. After that will be the bunks. Oftentimes I make cutouts for doors and hatches, and by using thin curved blades I can use the cutout for the door. It just saves material. End up with a bit of a gap, but it works out for the style that I'm after. Here's the new sole for the forward part of the cabin. That was the pattern. Here's the plywood cutout. Here I'm making cutouts for the frames. There I'm gluing on a perimeter sort of a ledge that the hatches sit in. And once again, I'm very carefully with thin curved blade, I'm cutting such that I can reuse the cutout for the hatch. Here I'm gluing up the ledger that supports the bilge access hatches. I used 1/2-inch plywood for all the sole pieces, and it ended up being nice and stiff after the various stiffeners and other things got glued in. Ended up being less than half the weight of the old sole, and here it is in place for one of the many dry fits. Forward cab and overheads going in. I did not use any fasteners. I just used foam and Gorilla Glue. Kind of time consuming using this method, and I ended up using foam to install a lot of things. I just didn't want to see fasteners. But again, takes a bit of time. You gotta wait. And here's a bunch of sticks holding those foam side panels in. My painting technique is a little different. After filling the grain with either epoxy or varnish, my preferred method is to lay the panels flat, and then I just basically flood it with a big puddle of paint. It's one coat. It takes a long time to dry, and that was a problem. I eventually solved it by building this in-shop sort of a drying booth. The problem is it'd be wet for at least a day or two, which means that the shop isn't usable unless you could get it under cover. But anyway, the technique works good. I end up with nice glossy finishes with just one coat. Here's some side panels going into the forward cabin. That's a pattern for the main double bunk. So the boat's now going to have a permanent double bunk. That's one of the goals of this whole project. On the starboard side is my daughter's child bunk. Here I'm starting to put in some woodwork. I like the white paint. I want it nice and bright, but just stark white is no good. You got to have some woodwork up there kind of tone it down. So once again, I like to dry fit things and assemble them as much as possible in place, get everything all ready, and then I like to take things back out and finishing them on the bench so I can flow the varnish out real nice. Anyway, I'm pretty happy with the way the interior came out. That's cedar for those large trim pieces. I'm not real wild about fiddly little trim pieces. I like nice, big, heavy looking stuff. So I added a bilge pump. The boat's never had an electric bilge pump before, and well, let's call this just a dewatering pump. It'll probably never be used. It's just for an emergency. If you're getting a lot of water on board, you need to get rid of it quick. So that was the hole going into the hull. That's 2-inch pipe. I just bought a threaded nipple online, real inexpensive, and welded it to the end of this pipe. Get the cutoff marked off there, and I welded a flange onto it. You don't see it in these pictures, but it made it so that I did not have to weld on the inside. It's just welded on the outside, and the reason for that is here on the inside, it's just lots of foam, and it's a very inaccessible area. That's also the reason for the standpipe, or for that long length. It's the only way I can reach the shutoff valve. Here's the new head that I'm building. It's a composting head, or maybe more appropriately a desiccating head, which means to dry. It's pretty simple. You divert the urine and the feces, and you end up with dry feces in a bucket with some sort of a media. You can use dirt, peat moss. I've been using coconut coir, and it's been working real well. It's absolutely odor-free, real easy to use, and pretty large capacity. So anyway, the front of that enclosure box needed a special shape, and I just wanted it to look nice, so I ended up making a curved piece of wood using 3 layers of 1/8-inch Akume plywood. So here I'm getting things shaped up for a nice fit onto the front of the enclosure box. By doing this, what it means is the forward edge of the toilet seat is proud or overhanging where your feet go, and it just makes for more comfortable when you're sitting on the toilet and being able to maneuver in that very small space. I was going to paint it white, but you'll see it took some varnish pretty nicely. A small computer fan is constantly drawing air out of the enclosure box and overboard through the anchor hose pipe. That's the holding tank for the urine, and the finished head came out pretty nice. It's very bright, no wood other than that forward part of the head enclosure. So just before launch time here in the spring of 2017, I got ambitious and I wanted to modify my mast once again. Here I'm sawing off the very mast head, and ended up cutting 4 feet off the mast. Previously, you'll see that the taper was achieved by using facets, and I built that out of flat plate. Again, it was tapered and welded it on, but that's all getting cut off now. And I'm using a new technique to create taper. It's just for looks. These pipe spars, when you just cap them, they end up looking pretty boxy up on top. So I did a little simple geometry, and you'll see what I did here. I make some slices, and I'm able to sort of squeeze things together. There's that first slice going in. I suppose it also makes the masthead a little lighter, and certainly lightweight is the goal here, and less windage. This boat ends up being a little tender. These boats aren't known for their stiffness to begin with, but I've added a pilot house and just overall more weight. So to get 20-25 pounds out of the masthead, well, that should make a difference. Close up of the beginning of the welds to sew up those seams. So here everything's getting pretty well sewn up. I'm welding the old mast cap back on. Here I'm getting the welds ground out, installing some new tangs. All the halyards on this boat are external. Shivs just get attached with shackles. It's real simple. There's no fasteners up there, nothing to really maintain or wear out. So that was the last of the projects for this long winter on the hard. I got a nice clean bilge out of the deal that's got room to store stuff. Got a permanent double bed to port and a bunk for my daughter on the starboard side. Lots of storage underneath. I even got a new roll-up dinghy that'll fit under that bunk. The davit works great as a motor crane. Got a nice clean head that's comfortable once you're sitting in there. Good anchor chain storage, and that's where the chain drains to. Mast is a little shorter. It makes stepping it easier. That weight out at the end is pretty critical during this phase of raising, because there's a huge amount of stress on all that rig. I don't know, boat looks a little better with a shorter mast. Still got a good angle on my peak halyard. Boat sails fine. It's certainly no more tender. Might be a little stiffer. I did get the ballast lower. The whole boat's floating about an inch, maybe an inch and a half higher. So overall, I'm real pleased. Things are a lot nicer aboard the boat. I hope you enjoyed the video, and we'll see you next time.